What is Vedantic philosophy or Vedantic Christianity? Does it make sense, and how can we understand it? I'm Lisa Colon-DeLay, and I've been doing a little series on the images of God we have, common in the West and uncommon in the East and Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox way of thinking. Some of our Christian views have been influenced by empire, the Roman Empire, influenced by these conceptions of Zeus, which turns out to be rather illogical when we give them more careful thought. I've been elucidating the concepts of David Bentley Hart, a philosopher, cultural commentator, brilliant scholar, and I will be speaking now about Christian Vedantic thought. So, Hart argues for Christian Vedantic, or a mystical view where God is all-encompassing, and sovereignty is expressed not by this domineering puppeteering and determinism, but is expressed through theosis or our divination, meaning that we are coming into God all in all and eventually join up with God. This is a very Eastern Christian viewpoint, but it is more original to Jesus's thoughts, the Jewish thoughts, that from where Christianity comes from. Talk about what is Vedantic. What does this mean? So it refers to a philosophical, a spiritual, and a metaphysical, the teachings derived the final section of the Vedas, focusing on the non-dualistic oneness of existence, the divinity of the soul, and the unity between the individual self and the ultimate reality, or Brahman. Now, these concepts, although they do not sound Christian, follow in a logical way to understand God in a more Eastern way that might be more cohesive and logical. This emphasis is what consciousness is, the ultimate non-dual truth that liberation is achieved through self-knowledge and the dissolution of illusionary duality. So there is no separation from us and God or us and others, except in individual ways, but not in the ultimate ways. We are one, and we seem divided and we seem individualized, but the truest reality is that we are not. Non-dualism, the core belief of the individual soul, is identical to the supreme absolute reality, represents a non-dual view. Another aspect is that consciousness is fundamental. And some of this is coming out in our science right now in terms of quantum physics. Vedanta holds that consciousness is not a byproduct of matter, but the fundamental reality that manifests in all, and that life originates from life. The goal is to understand the true divine nature of the self, dissolving the illusion of a separate ego. David Bentley Hart utilizes Vedantic ideas primarily to bolster a specific, non-dualistic, and universalist interpretation of Christian theology, aiming to bridge the Eastern and the Western metaphysics. He argues that traditional, particularly Western Christianity, has often adopted a very narrow view of God, and that Vedanta helps recover a richer, more mystical understanding of divine reality. When we think about it, there is no way that God can fit into our categories. God is ultimate. God is reality itself. There is no beginning and no end to God. So we have to think of categories as being sort of blown up instead of narrowing them down to Zeus-type figures. In The Experience of God, written in 2014, Hart uses the Vedantic concept of being consciousness bliss to explain that God is not just a supreme being among other supreme beings, the God of gods, for instance, but instead the very ground of being. Think creator, creative force, and the person of God. To promote Vedantic Christianity, Hart explores a form of Christianity where the separation between God and creation is collapsed. In his book called You Are Gods, 2022, he posits that similar to the Vedantic view, humans are fundamentally divine, and that ultimate end of humans is union with God. Vedantic philosophy often views the self as a part of a grander whole, which aligns with Hart's firm commitment to universalism. The belief that all conscious beings will eventually be reconciled to God. And that doesn't mean that there's no hell per se, but it just won't be the eternal conscious torment so many of us have been forced into believing and accepting. The idea of a kind of purgative place after death is actually quite common in a whole bunch of Christian traditions, especially the earliest ones. To reframe salvation as deification or theosis, Hart relies on Eastern Orthodox tradition of deification, which he believes finds a stronger metaphysical parallel to Vedanta's assertion of the ultimate unity of self with the ultimate reality. And this idea of unification and theosis is also something the Desert Fathers and Mothers would have been very aligned with. Most of them would have come from these points of view. To challenge dualistic Western theology, David Bentley Hart finds Western, particularly neo-Thomist definitions of nature and supernature very limiting. He uses Vedantic non-dualism to challenge the idea of a harsh separation between the natural world and the supernatural world, preferring to view where all things are filled with God. In Celtic Christianity, you might say nature is translucent with God. And so this kind of idea that God is all in all, in and moves in and through us, in our beings and in all of reality itself, is something the Apostle Paul speaks about. That's been mainly left behind in dualistic thought that came after, hundreds of years after the life of Christ on earth. As an analogical tool, Hart argues that just as the early church fathers used Neoplatonism to define the Trinity, modern theology can and should use Vedantic concepts to deepen its understanding of God. In the past, Christianity used Neoplatonic ideas to understand concepts like the Trinity, help us understand them. Maybe we can't know them fully, but maybe we can get a little glimmer, a little clue of how things really are. Taking these concepts of Vedantic philosophy can help us understand how God is all in all, God is supreme, the originator, and the one to whom we will all return eventually, after a time of purgation that might be termed hell, but is not eternal. We've been very long into this modernity thing where we are materialists and we think of things as spiritual and physical when the spiritual is in and through all things. Perhaps Hart is just drawing us closer to our true Christian origins. What people may not realize about Christianity is that it began as an Eastern religion, and it was hundreds of years later that these ideas of Christianity, an offshoot of Judaism in the East, were massaged and formulated into Western ideas that varied from Jewish thought and from the tradition that is what Jesus is most connected with as a Jew. It's for you to think on. You can pray about it and you can decide for yourself. But it gives us a lot to chew on and think about. Perhaps the ways we've thought about God, perhaps the ways we've thought about reality itself, have been these tortured ideas formulated and squashed into forms that make no sense now that we have a greater understanding of what reality is all about. And we can understand from other conceptions of God's being as being itself. And perhaps that can draw us closer to God in more intimacy. I thank you for listening. If you have thoughtful comments, they are welcome, but you must subscribe to leave comments. Once you subscribe, you will also get alerts to some of my live events, and I hope to see you there.